Hello and welcome to the episode 2 of our microservice tutorial series. In the last video, we have created a simple Spring Boot application and we have also exposed a simple API. In this video, we are going to go through that application, understand different folder and file structure of that application, and we'll do a complete analysis on that application. When you explore your project, you would be able to see there are certain files and folders. Out of all these files and folders, let's open this file called pom.xml file, which is a heart of your Maven application. So whenever you are building any application, it's not something which is specific to Spring Boot. It is something specific to Maven application. Since we have selected Maven as our project type, that's the reason why we are getting this pom.xml file, which stands for Project Object Model. And this is a Maven specific file, wherein we mention any external dependencies that we are having, any kind of properties for that application. For example, the name of that application, artifact ID, version information, as well as any additional dependency like what is the Java version that we are using, any kind of additional dependencies. Like we have added this dependency while creating this application called Spring Boot Starter Web. Apart from this, we can add more dependencies as we need it, right? For example, in future, if at all I'm working with MySQL, I can add the MySQL dependency here. This is exactly equivalent of the package.json file, which you might find in a Node.js application or in a JavaScript based application. Second very important thing here, of course, is the src folder. Some other folders you can see like .idea, .mvn. These are ID generated folders and you don't need to do anything with that. Similarly, there is one more folder called target. Target would be generated whenever you are building that application. So for time being, let's ignore all the other folders and let's focus on this src folder. So let's expand this src folder and you would be able to see there are again two parts, main and test. As I have already discussed the same thing in the previous video as well. Main, which will contain your source code, and test, which will contain your unit test cases. Now let's expand the main. And we know already that whenever we are expanding the Java, we will get all the Java code. Next, let's expand this resource folder. So when we are expanding this resource folder, we will be able to see some other folders in it, and also we'll be able to see there is a file called application.properties. So what is that application.properties file? This is a property file wherein you can mention any specific property with respect to your Spring Boot application. For example, you want to run your application. By default, the application runs on 8080. If at all you want to change this and you want to run it on maybe 5000, let's write it. Server.port equal 5000. Let's save this, and if I run this or relaunch this application right now, the application has started on port 5000. You'll be able to access this application on port number 5000. Any other things like in future, you might be working with the databases. So if at all you want to mention some database properties, you would be mentioning it on this properties file. Let's also explore this file, which we have already used earlier. This consists of the main method class of your Spring Boot application. So what is there actually? There is an annotation at Spring Boot application, which is a combination of different other annotation we have, like at Spring Boot configuration, at enable auto configuration, at component scan, and many more. So right now we don't know about so many annotation with respect to Spring Boot, and we will be learning it in our upcoming videos. For time being, you just need to know this annotation is very important, and you are saying that this is a Spring Boot application and do all the auto configuration and do all the stuffs that are required for a Spring Boot application. And when you run this application, again, there is a code which is spring application.run, and you are providing the name of the main method class with some arguments. So what do you mean by that? This code will launch up your application. It will launch up your Tomcat server, because any application needs some server, right? So whenever you are running a web application, you need a server to host that application. So it launch up that embedded Tomcat server and it starts that application on that server, or it serves that application on that server. So it does a lot of things behind the scene. You don't need to do any setup or anything. You just create that application, run some code, and it's working. But behind the scene, these codes are responsible for all such things. So this is what your application contains. So what is actually happening behind the scene, if at all we need to understand a little bit more. So let's try to understand it. You have your Spring Boot application here. and you have some browser here. This is your client. So which is basically right now we are using a browser. So this is our client, which is, let's suppose, Chrome. And this is our Spring Boot application. So whenever we are accessing this Spring Boot application, so usually Spring Boot, just like any other web application, we have the same model, request and response. So we are making a request to this application. So we are making some request to this application, and in return, the server is responding with some response. This is your request and this is your response. Now behind the scene, how Spring Boot is processing your request. So whenever any request come to your Spring Boot application, we do have a dedicated controller here, which is known as a front controller, and which is also known as the dispatcher servlet. So this every request is being handled by this guy called dispatcher servlet. Any kind of request. So right now we made a request like hello or /person, right? So whatever it might be, /hello or /person. So whatever request that we are making, so that is coming to this dispatcher servlet. Now this particular request would be forwarded or would be transferred to a dedicated controller. That's what we have created. So we created a controller called my first API. So whatever request that is coming, that is going to this controller called my first API, because this is the place where /hello is being handled. So let's see what happens behind the scene. So here we have the controller my first API. So your request is going to this my first API. Let's connect these two. Then your API is returning with, for example, hello in case of hello, or in case of person. So your API is returning an object of person. An object of person is being returned. Now what happens here? This person is obviously a Java object, and what we are getting in return is a JSON. So how this Java object is being converted to JSON? Let's try to understand. This is something that Spring Boot is doing for you, and with the help of some dependency that is present in your application. Let's see. There is a dependency. If you scroll down and if you expand the external libraries, there is a dependency called JSON. Right, so you would be able to see that there is a dependency called JSON. There are multiple dependencies: JSON, JSON core, JSON data bind, and so on. So this is the dependency which is responsible for mapping your Java object to a JSON and vice versa. Also, whenever you are writing this annotation at REST controller, it is a combination of multiple annotation. So we have at controller and at response body. Now what is at controller? At controller says that it is a controller. And at response body makes it a REST controller, because we want our application, we want our controller or API to return some resources. So at response body is an annotation which is responsible. So if you look at this, which is coming from, again, Spring Framework web bind annotation, and which is the annotation which is responsible for returning this person object in JSON form. If you don't have that annotation, so if I remove this REST controller annotation and if I write only controller annotation wherein the response body is not mentioned, then if I relaunch this application, let's relaunch this application and let's go to our application. Let's hit localhost /hello or /person, hit enter. And you can see there's an error page, right? So this is the standard error page. We'll talk about it later on, but we can see there is an error, which is a type of internal server error. Okay. So what is the error? Why I'm getting this error? Because the problem is what we are trying to return is an object, right? And whenever you write it as a controller, what it will try to return is a page, right? So there is a concept called view. We are not discussing about this because we are focusing more on the REST web services, RESTful APIs. But for your understanding, let me tell you, when you write only controller, what it returns is a view or another page. Now we are not returning a page, rather what we are returning is an JSON value, right? So is a resource. So for that, we need to annotate this with additional annotation, which is called response body. So we have to write response body. So the moment we write at response body, and now if we relaunch this application and if we refresh it, you'd be able to see we are getting the value as JSON. So rather than writing two different annotation, controller and response body separately, what we do, we write at rest controller here. Now we don't need to write this additional annotation. All the functions or all the methods here will automatically return my REST APIs or REST endpoint. So that's the point here. This is all about your Spring Boot application. In our next video, we would be understanding the different annotations, Spring specific annotations. What is auto varying? What is dependency injection? How these annotations are actually working, whether it is REST controller annotation. And we would be having lots of other classes, lots of layer in our application, and we'll try to understand how they work. So that's all for this video. Thank you so much for watching.